Hi, my name is Stephanie Jones, and my preliminary analysis examines the role of domestic violence in refugee and immigrant families in transition in the context of their ongoing processes of integration and assimilation into American culture. The Karen refugees resettled in Portland from Burmese and Thai refugee camps and served by the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization known as IRCO are my target population. I developed this topic and chose this population in collaboration with two upper management IRCO staff members. One is the IRCO program coordinator for the Refugee and Immigrant Family Empowerment Program, known as RIFE. And the other is a woman who is an IRCO family engagement specialist. In 2012, IRCO served over 26,000 clients, and of these, over 11,000 sought family and domestic violence services. My key questions so far are: how does domestic violence percolate in these families, and how might service providers assist families experiencing the dual stresses of domestic crisis and cultural and social assimilation? And I'd also like to know what influences immigrants' help-seeking behavior. Domestic violence is an urgent issue in our community because it is the most common cause of non-fatal injury to women in the United States, and it creates long-term social and economic costs. And there's also strong research evidence that children witnessing domestic violence have a much higher rate of either being in violent relationships when they grow up, or being perpetrators of violence. Further, the two IRCO staff members that I spoke with argued that the general stigma attached to domestic violence is much more pronounced in the Asian diaspora communities. And without connections to culturally sensitive resources, the minority and gender status of immigrant women increases their vulnerability to exploitation, oppression, and disempowerment. My theoretical approach was guided by Ashton Wilson's insight that domestic violence appears to work differently within different families based on ethnicity and religious belief. I will use an immigrants in context framework that focuses the lens on the interplay between immigrants and refugee experience of domestic violence in their current socio-cultural context in the United States and that of their country of origin. Interethnic attitudinal and religious differences may shed light on how cultural norms of domestic violence vary and how differences in attitudes towards abuse may be defined by ethnicity. In research on the Cambodian diaspora and domestic violence, it showed that more studies are needed on specific groups to explain how marital relations change after families settle in the U.S. And service providers need to understand the sociocultural differences that shape specific displays of domestic violence and how survivors interpret and respond to abuse. Structural factors in alignment with those described by IRCO staff member, namely that English language ability, economic status, and concern for ability to provide for children, immigration status, and a lack of understanding of U.S. laws are some of the other levels that must be considered in relation to how people respond to domestic violence as they attempt to adjust and assimilate into American life. So my design and methodology for this bit of data analysis was an interview with two upper management IRCO staff members. I, since the beginning of the term, have been volunteering at least once a week at Madison High School in an IRCO-sponsored SUN program there, and also I've been working twice a week with two Karen families. But I'm not allowed to use any data that I collect from any of the IRCO clients until I have my RB on file with IRCO. So I'm a little bit limited for this data analysis to the staff members. So my data and analysis, one thing that came to be was that there's a strong need for volunteers. They really, really are desperate for volunteers, and as Portland grows, their clients keep getting pushed further and further east, like really far east. And um, one of the quotes that they said was, "It's hard to get most volunteers to venture past 82nd, and our people are past 182nd." And one of the families that I work with is well past, they're past 200th, 200th and Powell. And research on Cambodian families demonstrated that the structural conditions of public housing away from public transportation in city centers collude with abusers' efforts to isolate women. And mixed public housing developments and women's socioeconomic position can further erode family and community ties that may have served as buffers to domestic violence in the past. Another quote was that domestic violence permeates everything we do. We really want to know about this specific kind of domestic violence, families in transition, and how this works. Integration and acculturation, and within ethnic groups, the different subgroups, whether like Karens or Christians or Muslims or Buddhists, ERCO staff feel like affects how domestic violence works, and also affects help-seeking behavior in women. And also alcohol. They feel like alcohol is a big part of it. And alcohol kind of, in my preliminary literature review, is kind of complicated because alcohol definitely plays a role in domestic violence. But at the same time, many researchers argue that it's important to understand that alcohol does not cause domestic violence. And so I'm curious to read more and kind of understand that differentiation. Also understanding men's experiences. Many of the cultures that in groups that ERCO serves are coming from places where traditionally masculinity is defined by not doing. Men don't do, and women cook and clean for them, and that kind of informs their masculinity. And then when they come to the U.S., it's thought that is kind of flipped on them, where here traditional definitions of masculinity involve doing, earning money and, paying for your family and that. So it's all of a sudden you come here and you don't speak the language, and your kind of traditional way that you define your masculinity is completely opposite. So understanding how that works. The experience of refugee and immigrant families experiencing domestic violence has to be contextualized within the conditions of the social and political upheaval that took place during refugee migration and resettlement. And the gender dynamics changed during and after migration and settlement, often causing tension between traditional patriarchal gender roles. So there has been some research done with Korean women with this. When they come to the U.S., they're coming from traditional patriarchal societies where the man makes all the financial decisions and earns the money, and then they come here and they work and they have their own money, and that can cause a lot of tension. And then also specifically with the Karen refugees, they're coming from refugee camps and from political situations where violence, all sorts of violence, or just kind of permeate everything. And also looking at language, you kind of have to look at the different generations of people, and also the ERCO staff really impressed upon me that you have to differentiate not just between religion and generation, but also between people that speak and don't speak English, because they said English is a huge factor across the board of, people's earnings and how much education that they finish, and that's a big deal. And English skills are not only necessary to obtain an education and employment in the U.S., but language is a significant barrier to accessing community services, navigating the legal system, using public transportation, or just having a conversation with a neighbor and being able to reach out. I feel that my methodological approach, even though it's just one interview, generated valid and reliable data because my two informants have both worked with my target population for over 7 years, and their views were definitely corroborated in the literature review. However, I do not have enough data to answer my research questions yet. If I can gain some insight into the specific nature of domestic violence in Korean families through a longer study, I do feel that this would benefit service providers trying to provide culturally sensitive care. My biggest surprise during these interviews was the focus on men, because typically research on domestic violence focuses on women and children and not so much on men's experiences. And I thought that that was important to understand the depth of struggles that families in transition face. You have to understand men's experiences, and focusing on victims is necessarily after the fact. Prevention is always preferable, and I think prevention requires understanding the driving forces behind domestic violence, understanding the experience of the perpetrator. And then I have a quote here from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. Although domestic violence research on Asian immigrants remains limited in general, recent studies on specific Asian groups have offered insight into cross-cultural differences among and within Asian populations. And Asian cultures share some general themes with regard to domestic violence, but significant differences in attitudes supporting wife abuse were demarcated by ethnicity. So it's very important to look at different ethnic groups and then the subgroups within those groups to understand how violence works and to help community organizations make culturally sensitive programs and to understand help-seeking behavior in women so that the programs can address those behaviors. And that's all. Thank you.